Thank you, Maurice, for the previous presentation. I think there may be some additional points here of overlap. As Jason mentioned, we're going to be continuing our discussion of Francis's and Shima's paper on and discussion on local field theory. And I stole Francis's vector image here that I particularly liked from his presentation to remind us of the field. And so I thought I would address in my 7 slides here today really 3 points of discussion, and I'll probably really just focus on one. So the first is, and Maurice touched on this, which is the distinction between levels of consciousness, content of consciousness, and consciousness itself. And then also to address and really focus on their proposal that meaning is felt as affective tension. And I think that is a particularly salient, important point that I think that I'd like to discuss further. And then lastly, I'll just briefly touch on what I particularly like is their coining of the idea of soft solutions to hard problems. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a psychiatrist here in San Francisco, assistant professor at UCSF, and I met Francis and Shima actually through the nonprofit Human Energy organization that we work with. Okay. So briefly, levels, content, and consciousness itself. I thought this was particularly useful, just turning to the dictionary. So this is the Oxford Dictionary, and I think there's actually about 4 or 5, maybe 5 or even 6 entries on consciousness, but the first 3 address these core issues. And so I think it helps us frame what it is we're actually focusing on and talking about. So definition number 1, the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings. So that's what I would refer to as the state or level of consciousness. And as I think I mentioned when we were first discussing their paper, the state of consciousness, it really depends on our ability to the report that another human, and typically in this case, can indicate about their state of consciousness. And so it may have some relationship to Maurice's use of the word sapience, although we could come back and discuss the distinction between sentience and sapience. But Jonathan Schooler, for example, refers to the ability to report on one's state of consciousness, not as consciousness, but as metaconsciousness. And I think that that's an important point, particularly because there's an emerging body of research where, done with, I think it's Jennifer Wint, where research subjects are woken up in the middle of so-called dreamless sleep. There's no indicative REM activity, and yet they report having some sort of experience during this time when they're awoken. So to refer to those states as unconscious sort of fits our general use of the term unconscious, but may not fit the sort of sense that there's an absence of some sort of experience. So then the second definition from Oxford is that the awareness or perception of something by a person. This sort of fits the classic content or qualia definition. And by this, I would sort of would agree or reflect on the definition by Ned Block that this is phenomenal consciousness, which is what experiences that there is something that it feels like. And then the last definition here is the fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world. So this is consciousness in itself, which I would suggest is a metaphysical question, which is somewhat distinct from the other 2 definitions. And so what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my slides is largely this feels like aspect. And so I want to jump off from what Francis and Shima proposed about meaning that is felt as some sort of tension. And so part of their intuition here, I suspect, is they're defining or identifying the moving nature of consciousness that is reflected both in our phenomenology and our language. So we're moved, we're touched, we're affected by our experience. And so for Francis and Shima, they've put this in the concept of local fields as forces. And I think they were pretty clear with us when we last met that this was a conceptual local field or a conceptual field. And so that might be important to consider. And then they also linked this sense of tension as potentially related to appetitive or aversive behavior in organisms. And so I think this raises the question, as they do, about, primitive organisms or bacteria. Do they have quote unquote true consciousness? At least from what I read, they would from at least per our conversation last time, it sounded as if we would say probably not, and that consciousness, as we most typically think of, is linked to higher order brain systems, and they cite workspace theory in this regard. And so I think I'd focus on two questions about this. One is what is the tension? I'd like to get a little bit more precise about what we're referring to, and what are some potential biological models that might capture this tension. So tension between what and what, but also to really look a little bit more carefully at the distinction between, say, an amoeba and a brain. Where can we say there is a distinction between sort of true consciousness and unconsciousness, or some other process? And what I'm going to at least propose, and this is borrowing from the work of Terry Deacon, is that the tension is between information relevant to the goal state of an organism and the embodied dynamics of the state of that organism. And so that there's this sort of strange loop between those two, because the information relevant to that goal state is what is sustaining the actual embodied dynamics, but that also those very embodied dynamics and typically the physical processes that sustain them are what's necessary to enable the information processing systems in the first place. And so I'll portray that through a couple examples. So let's start with amoebas. Are they zombies? I'm just going to juxtapose two quotes that I particularly thought were interesting on this topic. The first is from Evan Thompson's article in the Journal of Consciousness, Could All Life Be Sentient? And he asks, can there be intrinsically purposive autopoietic agents that respond to values as norms of flourishing but without feeling hedonic value or affective valence? The empirical argument is inconclusive. That's one perspective. And Mankey in the Journal of Biosemiotics argues that, well, actually, there's no such thing as mindless inwardness, because there is no such thing as a living being that does not care about itself, that does not want to survive, and does not work toward its survivals. The teleological structure of living organization entails some degree of subjective experience, however minimal it may be, and she cites Hans Jonas, revealing consciousness to be an essentially affective and not cognitive phenomenon. So here's someone coming down rather firmly on the side that all living beings express some degree of something like what we might call consciousness. And so this is just to highlight, perhaps some of you have seen the example of the amoeba-like organism. It's a slime mold that is a single cell that solves mazes. So when this creature is hungry, it extends its pseudopodia through this maze to obtain a food result, or food reward, if you will, for this organism. And while I'm not sure about whether or not we should call this organism conscious in the sense that we typically use that word, but I do think there is something very much that fits the description of tension here. And here I would argue that the tension is between the information relevant to sustain autopoiesis, and the embodied state of autopoiesis. So this single cell organism clearly has all the biological machinery, if you will, to keep itself alive, but it also has an information processing system, extends out through these membranes that can go down and obtain the food rewards. And so there's a sort of an ability to utilize that information to sustain itself, and that what sustains is also what propels the information processing dynamics to continue. And that's where I would sort of see the tension. And I think the same. So what about the brain? How could we not talk about the brain? We're talking about consciousness. I I think I would argue the same process occurs in the brain, nested at a much higher level. Mark Soames in particular has written much about this and has proposed that much of these affective processes, emotional processes, are based in the brainstem. So here's one of the quotes from a review paper. I won't have time to go through all of the arguments around this, but he says many cognitive scientists still must be weaned of the view that the cerebral cortex is the seat of consciousness. The weight of evidence that the arousal processes generated in the upper brainstem and limbic system feel like something in and of themselves is now overwhelming. Among many lines of evidence is decorticate individuals, or this is a child with a condition known as hydroanencephaly. So basically born without a cerebral cortex, and yet they display pronounced emotionality responses to, in this case, there's a description Mark Soames goes into where this girl has her son, a baby infant, placed in her arms, and she smiles and laughs because there's another being a human being touching her. So how does this relate to this tension question? And I think that again, we could say, looking at the autonomic structures, that are within that are autonomic nuclei in the brainstem and midbrain. For those of you, there's a refresher: autonomic nervous system, fight or flight, rest or digest, right? This is what maintains core homeostatic processes, the heart, lungs, breathing, metabolism. These are largely thought of as unconscious processes, but are also deeply connected in terms of brain structure to processes that we're actually quite conscious of, right? So thirst, hunger, joy, satiation, all of these phenomena are deeply intertwined. And so here's this to highlight those brainstem structures that support the autonomic nervous system. Again, I think there's a similar, an analogous tension that can be drawn here between the information that's relevant to sustain the autonomic nervous system. That's all the information that comes in from our cerebral cortex, or from our environment, from our extended and embodied cognitive organisms. So we're drawing in all of that information, and that is contrasted against the current embodied state of the organism that is present in that is encoded to a large degree within brainstem phenomena. And so, and not only that, the brain is of course, a vascular organ. So there is blood flow pulsing throughout the brain that is also indicative of the presence of sort of stable homeostasis in metabolism. So just lastly, I'll just give you a brief description of how we've been describing this particular phenomenon in terms of the tension. And we see this as really sort of extending the embodied cognition paradigm, or the what's now known as the 4E, inactive, extended, embodied cognition. And I'm afraid we're probably going to be adding another E to this. But so the embodied cognition paradigm, of course, is we recognize the brain is not this disembodied information processing unit, but that depending on the context, that the body shapes information. There's extended nervous system that reports back about the environment. And not only that, we're not a passive body. We move through the environment. As we move through that extended environment, it provides additional information. So there's just as much cognition that occurs extended and beyond the body that is then just in the brain itself. And well, in some sense, I would suggest that this embodied cognition paradigm is no different from what we have. I live in San Francisco. We have all these self-driving cars all over the place. And I think that this is, in some sense, a computing and a version of embodied cognition. So they just put a lot of extra mirrors and cameras and gadgets on this machine so that its presence in the environment can feed back to the central computing system within the car. But this is pretty different, I would argue, than human embodied cognition, and relevant to our conversation today. I'd suggest that the car has no emotionality, no affect, no tension, whereas, of course, as a human being, we have high affect and tension. So what's the difference? What I'd suggest is that is something that we are being calling entangled cognition, which is that the metabolism is of high relevance. So in the car, the energy is of pretty low relevance to the information content. It's a circuit, whether the car's got, I mean, as long as the car's got a full tank of gas, it could care less. It's not going to feel, nervous or hungry that it's unable to get to its next destination. But in high contrast, a brain is deeply entangled with respect to energy and information. The energetic substrate is of high relevance to the information content. And again, it's that the relevance of information to the embodied or energetic substrate that is what determines the tension and affect. So I'll just conclude with this. It wouldn't be fair to have a conversation on consciousness without some touching on metaphysics. I won't. I'll say I won't put my nickel down. I'll put my soft nickel down, I guess, on this one, which is just to say I really liked Francis and Shima's use of the word soft solutions because there's a hard problem, and I think that maybe we best not try to solve it, but maybe take some soft steps towards that. One author that I've been particularly intrigued with lately is Ian McGilchrist. His book, The Matter with Things. And I think that he's pointing towards something that is useful here, which is that our emphasis on the literal structural material elements and trying to link those to consciousness is a problem somehow. And there are several alternative views on this that I might point people towards if they're interested. One is Terry Deacon's Metaphysics of Incompleteness, where he argues for not only a role for what is present in terms of material substance, but also what is absent, that those absences are actually rather critical towards constraint, and on the constraint on dynamics that give rise to phenomena like consciousness. That's one perspective. There's also others who have been focusing on process ontology with respect to biological systems, such as Anne Mankey, David Nicholson, and I already mentioned some of their ideas. And lastly, there's been a sort of reemergence of idealist perspectives. Bernardo Kastrup and Donald Hoffman have portrayed some views here, which I think have also brought this perspective into more modern, sort of a modern scientific updated version of the idealist perspective. So I'll just end with sort of saying that the metaphysical uncertainty about the ontology of consciousness need not interfere with the process of the science that we're undertaking. Perhaps some uncertainty might be a good thing for that process. And I will stop. Clarifying questions.
This is great. And the host here would say, fantastic. Okay. Thanks,